So, you've just sat down for a game of good old Magic the Gathering, some good old Commander, and you sit down with your budget deck. You haven't put a lot of time or money into it. You just kind of want to play. You like doing the thing. So you're sitting there, you're trying to do your thing. It's a bit of a lower power pod, but that's okay. It's budget. But slowly as you start to go through, you realize that yeah, it might be a lower power pod, but this deck really isn't doing what it needs to be doing. It's not performing how I want it to perform. And I'm kind of just sitting there for a couple turns, not really doing anything. I'm not building a board state, I'm not interacting with my opponents, and I don't really have an opportunity to swing any of my creatures. And then you ask yourself the question, is my budget deck really worth it? Have I just not put enough money into my deck to make it work? That question is a very tough question to answer, and it actually comes down to a lot of different factors. Today, we're going to be covering how to actually build a budget deck and how you should focus on building your decks in the future, budget or no budget. This is specifically for lower power decks. These are decks that are just here to compete. You're here to have a good time. You're talking with your friends while you're doing it. You're not really necessarily looking to force a win on turn 6 or 7. You're trying to go for a little bit of a longer game, and you're just trying to have some fun playing Magic. And you're trying to do it for cheap. So, let's go into how to build an actual budget deck. The more budget your deck becomes in Commander, the more I think it should operate like a sealed deck or a constructed deck in any other 60 card format for Magic. You want to run plenty of removal for threats that are going to show up. You want to run some sort of card draw engine that can help get through your deck. And you want to throw in a couple bombs that are going to help you get past the finish line. This is true with most standard and modern decks, especially in the sealed format. The first thing you'll need in your budget deck is what I like to call an engine. While your deck is not necessarily going to be the most effective thing, and it's not going to be super hyper tuned or have the best in slot for every single card, what it can have is card draw. There are plenty of cards out there that can provide you regular card draw every single turn. Whether it's 1 extra card or 2 extra cards a turn, these cards can help your budget deck run smooth enough where you don't really notice that it's lower power. What I will always recommend is having this card draw be in your command zone. And I know, having card draw in the command zone's kind of whatever. Feels a bit cheap. It seems like every commander nowadays that's either in a precon or made has some sort of payoff where you end up drawing cards. But I'm here to tell you that that is a good thing. You want to be able to draw through your deck somehow, even if it's just 1 or 2 cards a turn. But let's say you don't want card draw in the command zone and instead you want to go for a specific strategy with your commander. This is totally fine. In order to compensate for that, you will need quite a bit of card draw and card draw engines within your 99. Here's what I would recommend. If you have a commander that has card draw on a consistent basis, I would say put no more than 8 other draw spells within your 99. And if you have a commander that has no way of drawing cards, put anywhere from 12 to 16 ways to draw cards within your actual deck, whether this is through enchantments, creatures, draw spells, or artifacts. Give your deck plenty of ways to draw through the rest of your deck. So you have your engine. You have a way to draw through your deck very consistently. Now what you need to do is play more removal. You need to have more removal so that you can deal with your opponent's threats better. In higher power decks, usually removal is not as prioritized as you want to have more gas for your game plan so you can go through the game faster. But when you're going to play at such a slow pace, you're going to need to have plenty of removal because the game is going to be longer, which means there's more threats, which means you need to be able to remove things for a longer period of time. Because of this, I would say run anywhere from 16 to 20 removal spells in your budget decks. There are plenty of budget options for removal. If you're in red, look for good ways to deal damage. If you're in white, look for cheap ways to exile things or to board wipe. If you're in blue, look for cheap counter spells and look for cheap bounce spells. If you're in black, look for any sacrifice effects or look for any creature removal. And if you're in green, look for a lot of artifact and enchantment removal or fight spells. There are plenty of cheap options in both CMC and actual card price. Having engines in your deck and having plenty of removal in your deck is going to make your deck so consistent the budget does not matter. You will be able to stomp plenty of decks even at a low budget, even at a low power level. Now the goal is to figure out what is your strategy and how are you going to accomplish that? I would then allocate 16 to 20 cards for that main strategy. This is going to allow that strategy to show up enough throughout your games and draw into those cards that are with your strategy enough that you'll be able to execute your game plan multiple times in one game. In a budget to low power pod, you're almost always going to be winning through creature combat damage. There's not a lot of budget infinite combos out there. There's not a lot of budget infinite damage combos. There's just not a lot of budget combos, period. So you're going to be winning through creatures in most cases. Fun, fair, magic. So have anywhere from 16 to 20 of those cards being your main strategy. And lastly, you'll need ramp. In higher power decks, I 100% recommend having mana dorks, having plenty of mana rocks, and having plenty of ways to just get mana on the battlefield as quickly as possible. But in budget decks, I truly think spells that put lands onto the battlefield are gonna be your best bet. Any way you can have land ramp to thin your deck out even more is gonna be useful. The more you can thin your deck out with land ramp and the more engines you have means the more opportunities you get to find your bombs. Now, of course, green is much better at this than other colors are. However, there's plenty of very cheap cycling cards. There's plenty of really good fetch lands or lands that can help thin your deck on their own. And usually the decks that are not as good at land ramp, they're usually better at card draw or removal. So now that I've gone over a few ways to build budget to low power decks, let me give you two really good examples. I made this Kutzil Anthem deck pretty much as soon as I saw Cutzil for the first time. Cutzil is an example of a really good engine in the command zone. You bring out Cutzil, you can't really be interacted with, so you don't have to worry too much about removal. You play a few anthems, you play a few really good creatures, and you just swing out. You'll get to draw cards because all your creatures are going to be buffed up from anthems, which makes you draw more anthems, more removal, hit all your land drops, and just be able to overpower the rest of the decks on the table. Although it's budget, it's super effective at what it needs to do because of the card draw engine, and there's plenty of removal to help you get through the game. Next up is this Tatyova deck. Now, if you were playing Tatyova in a higher power deck, you almost always want there to be landfall. You want to run a ton of lands, you want to get plenty of landfall creatures out there, and you just want to do the thing. Now, while this deck does run quite a bit of lands, Tatyova is simply just a card draw engine. With plenty of land ramp spells through green and plenty of lands to choose from, this deck allows you to draw 2 to 3 extra cards per turn because of all the landfall triggers. And then, just like a normal green deck, you're playing some really good creatures, and you're winning through an overrun effect. A super cheap and yet super effective deck at what it needs to do. Now, both of these decks have card draw engines in them. The commander is the card draw. Again, I 100% super recommend you have a commander with plenty of card draw attached to it. Your commander is a guaranteed spell, and it allows you to run more cards that are for your strategy rather than spending so many resources on card draw within the 99. But let's say you really don't want a commander that has a card draw effect on it in your command zone. Let me show you to my Xenagos deck. This Xenagos deck I had made out of mostly chaff and super budget bombs. How do I compensate for the fact that I'm in red-green, which is not amazing at drawing cards? Well, I made most of my ramp land-based ramp. I use super cheap tutors that allow me to get the creatures that I need throughout a game, and I ran 16 different draw payoff spells. With all of these combined, the deck is definitely a lot slower than the other two decks previously mentioned, but the deck is able to consistently pull off the strategy that it's wanting to pull off every single game. So this is how I truly believe you build a budget deck. You build it as close to a standard to sealed deck as you can. You play a ton of card draw engines, and you play a bunch of removal with a lot less focus on your actual main strategy. Budget decks are fun as it limits the amount of resources you're actually able to use on a deck, and it increases the amount of creativity you have to use in what options you put where. Is there a cheap card that's super janky in most decks but actually kind of works in your deck? Awesome. That card is 35 cents at most. While I do enjoy the higher power of Commander, and I enjoy making super highly tuned decks that win really fast, this is always a really fun experiment to make decks that are really cheap and yet still super effective at what they need to do. Thank you all so much for watching. I have been Driver MTG, and this is how I make budget decks.